want to talk a little bit about how you see this question of culture as it's informed kind of your understanding and your, traditions that you're bringing forward in this, and just reflect on that a little bit?
Sure. I think there's three kind of main cultural paradigms that I operate out of. One, and I think, Allison, where you're saying it's just family, it's like family's everything, right? We're 90% water, and then the other 10% is like what gets passed down. My family is from a Jewish background, Sephardic and Ashkenazi, so Greek and Russian. Sometimes in the U.S. we'll say, Jews, the other white meat, right? We're a little different origin and culture perspective. And part of that is a really deep history in social justice, right? So, and some of that separation of Jews is in a really negative way, right? That it was no blacks or Jews written on the water fountains in the South, right? And I think that also led to a very deep history of solidarity, not just from like an allyship perspective, but because our lives also depend on it. And it's sort of no accident that Jews were the founders of the NAACP Legal Fund, that they were 90% of the freedom riders, even though we're only 2% of the US population. I'm very proud of that. And I think that some of that has ruptured over the last decades, and that's a whole other story. But I do think in terms of whether within my family or even as a cultural, not religious at all, Jew, there's something in the water. And I think that there's something in a lot of people's waters, and that it often can be kind of connecting back to what is the family history that we can connect into, and that can motivate us to want to carry that forward. The other that's kind of funny for me is, Jews historically managed a lot of money because it was viewed as a dirty profession, right? So they gave it to the Jews to do, and then, we took over the financial system, right? Right. So there's sort of the joke around my family is that I sort of stepped into that stereotype as well. But the other tradition that I was really steeped in and feel really informs my work is just traditions and learnings amongst social activists, and the sort of central notion of nothing about us without us, and how to think about accountability to affected communities, and seeing that as practice, right, as something that you have to do on a daily basis, not just a philosophy but an action. I feel like is a really critical component to my work, and it's part of why I'll often be at venues like the World Social Forum or Facing Race, where I'll have activists literally come up and say, wait, you're an investor? Like, why are you here, right? In a way that sometimes can even be a little bit hostile, which is fine. Like, there's great reasons for historic distrust of investors, but part of it is saying, if we want to really move from a purpose-driven place, how do we kind of stay accountable to social justice values within that? And I think the second piece to that is also about doing actions in collectivity. So I recently wrote a book, as some of you know, that came out last week called Real Impact. And one of the fights I kept having with my editor is that I kept saying we at moments when it was kind of more grammatically appropriate to say I, right? And she kept trying to edit out my we's, and I kept saying, well, but I never did any of this alone, right? Like, there were all these other people who were part of this. And that sort of vision of collectivity, and the importance of acknowledging that in every moment, I feel like is really critical in terms of connecting to purpose, because it is about that interconnection. And then the final one, unless I'm taking too much time, is that I do a lot in music and dance, and that has been a huge part of my life. I was a professional hip-hop dancer from years 15 to 20 before I decided that college was a good idea. I think that's the first time I've declared that publicly, but there it is. And part of what's beautiful about the dance community is that you have people from so many different backgrounds where you would never ask the question, what do you do, right? There are people I've had really deep relationships with for 20 years, where that is just kind of irrelevant, right? Because there's so many other ways that we're connecting and learning to be with each other, and that it might be people who I've never even spoken to, but I'm able to have this really deep connection in a very fast way through the arts. So I think that's the other that really informs my work, of thinking about what are ways of connecting with people, what are different ways of assessing worth that's not always just about what it is that you know, but how you make people feel. and that really translates into the way that I try to show up for people in terms of purpose.
So those are three pretty powerful examples of, again, the cultural mindset and tradition informing how you approach your work. Flipping it to the other side, are there things professionally as an investor that undermine your sense of kind of meaning and purpose and that you have to kind of fight against? Or are there the inverse of that? Are there things that you are asked to do professionally that actually affirm and advance what you're culturally trying to be about as well?
I love, Jed, one of the things that you inspire in people is authenticity. So I'll give you the first thought that popped into my head, which was really about stereotype embodiment. And I don't know if people are familiar with that term. It's one that I learned about much after I realized I was doing it, which is that when you start, when people perceive you in a certain way, you start acting more that way. And I was a first-time executive director when I was 23 years old. I was leading the Responsible Endowments Coalition. It's supporting college campuses across the country and investing their $400 billion towards social investment. And people presumed that I, knew nothing and nothing to add to the conversation. I was a woman, and that sort of continued throughout my career. I learned I couldn't wear black at certain events because people would ask me to get them water. People assumed I was the secretary, even if it had like managing director on my card. And I think those instances where I embodied that stereotype, right, and I would even go further to try to prove myself that I really had my financial chops and I knew what I was talking about, even just amplifies that sensation. So I guess I would say that times in my work that I have allowed myself to feel small by the actions of others, and that it took me a while to get trained out of that. And what was kind of interesting, when I started to get a good amount of gray hair, I started talking to women that were older than me in the field, and I realized I wasn't going to age out of it. And what was really disconcerting, I was pretty depressed for about a month after, I realized it wasn't ageism, it was sexism. And that I wasn't going to get to age out, right? That I was going to be stuck with this. And therefore, I needed to figure out another way to get past that, essentially. Part of that is that I have a male business partner who is unbelievably supportive. So there's some venues where I'll just say, you need to go to this instead of me. I know I'm not going to be comfortable. And he's okay with that. So I think you learn how to self-manage in venues that are not always going to be kind to you in whatever body you happen to be born into.
Sure.
And other ways that you push past it.
Morgan, are we at risk of becoming untethered from purpose?
I think that when we start to really focus on the questions of how, in terms of execution, that we've done that really well from a financial perspective, and that we've answered a lot of the questions around, like, can we scale? Can we get market rate? Can we do some of these really essential tasks? But can we do it in a way that scales the purpose alongside the impact? That to me feels like the execution gap. So it's connecting to purpose from an execution perspective, right, to get both of those things together. So for example, in the traditional finance world, less than 3% of fund managers are Black or Latino. And I think the average impact investor would likely get up on stage and say that they support racial justice, but then you look at their portfolios and it doesn't necessarily look that different, right? And then it becomes the question of, well, what are the practices that would actually get you from your stated purpose to manifesting that in the world, right? So one of the things that we did recently was finally went through and said, okay, yes, we say we care about racial justice, but what does our portfolio look like? And what we found out is that it looks really awesome. It's about 60% people of color if you exclude the clean tech investments, where we are absolutely over-indexed towards white men. And part of that has to do with the way the clean tech field is structured, but it caused us to think a lot about, well, yes, some of those investments are specifically targeted towards communities of color, so they're doing solar installations in low-income communities in Louisiana, or they're retraining former coal workers in West Virginia to become solar installers, but that we might need to do more to think about the ownership or think about the founders and diversity from that perspective. So that gives me an action plan of saying, okay, I'm still on my purpose, but I need to drive my purpose a little more when I'm looking at clean tech, right? Like, what's the specific practices that actually support your purpose Right now, when I ask a lot of managers, so how do you learn about what social change is needed, of how you're manifesting that purpose? And a couple times I've gotten the answer, well, I read the New York Times. I mean, I read the New York Times too, it's a great publication. But the point is, right, if you're trying to make social change, what do you need to do to be much more consistently educated, engaged, and accountable to your purpose? And I would posit it takes as much discipline as it does to execute your financial mission, right? It can't just be kind of an add-on to that financial mission.